Hello, good people of the world. It's the Big Heavy, and this is a big one today. I've got two of the titans of the home battery bank slash solar generator slash whatever you want to call these suckers product category. And frankly, I wouldn't be doing this comparison if it weren't for you. I had that initial comparison of the Jackery 1500 versus the Jackery 1000. I'll have a link to that video flying around my head somewhere, but several people in the comments said you should really be comparing the Jackery to the Bluetti, and I was able to get a review unit from Bluetti, and we'll be comparing both of these guys today. So before we go into the physical specifications of these two units, I want to address a few elephants in the room. So first off, I did receive both these units from the manufacturer, the Jackery obviously from Jackery and the Bluetti from Bluetti respectively, and I think that's actually the ideal situation for a review like this. If I had paid for one of these, I might have what the fancy folks call a bit of an unconscious bias towards whichever one I paid for, because I wouldn't want to admit that I had made a poor financial decision. And you may argue that perhaps having paid for both of these would have been the ideal situation. I would disagree in that if I had the scratch to pay for two expensive battery units, I'd be sitting on an island drinking umbrella drinks instead of doing a review in a hot room above my garage. Second thing to address, this is the Jackery 1500. I'm comparing it to the Bluetti AC200P. This is a 2000 amp hour unit versus a 1500. What makes that a legitimate comparison is the Jackery 2000 is essentially this guy plus about 30%. And it's about 30% in terms of capacity, 30% in terms of weight, a little less than 30% in terms of size. And I'll note where there's a difference when I go through the specs, and there is one physical difference that I think is pretty interesting that we'll talk about, and I'll call it out specifically. And frankly, I didn't want to ask Jackery for another gigantic battery unit and have that floating around my house somewhere, so the 1500 is a good comparative device. Third elephant in the room I want to address is this guy here. Hello, elephant. How are you today? As everyone knows, elephants have British accents. So with that out of the way, let's go to the tail of the tape. Now, starting out with the actual physical layout of these two units, you can see they're both pretty large, they're both pretty heavy, and the Jackery kind of goes with this design philosophy that I call the gigantic lunchbox. So you can see kind of a rectangular unit, has this big handle on top, the handle's nice and wide, you can get two big hands on there if you need to, and you can actually carry it one-handed. It's a little bit awkward. You end up having it as sort of this bizarre too large suitcase, so if you carry it standing as you normally would, it'll bang against your legs, so you kind of have to chuck it out to the side, throw your hip out there a little bit, which makes it a bit awkward to carry, but I would say it's a little bit easier to move around than the Bluetti, which goes and uses what I would call the gigantic heavy case of beer design philosophy. You can see it's basically a big old box. It's rectangular, it's squared off other than some nice rounded corners, and has these two large handles up on the top where you can grip it. The nice thing about these handles, they did put a little rubberized, textured bit of material in there, so they feel nice when you grab them, nice and solid to grab, but it is really difficult to move. I wouldn't want to carry this around one-handed. You physically can, but then you've got this gigantic thing sort of banging around in a rather awkward manner. Bringing this up to, I'm in the detached garage, I'm on the second floor of that, so I had to take this from my house down a set of stairs, up another set of stairs, and I would consider myself in reasonably good shape, but I was panting, and this was a good effort to move. So a bit of a larger unit, a bit more difficult to move, but what I think is interesting about this kind of square or rectangular box design is if you were handy, I could see you building this into the console of a van, and you could kind of build it into a piece of furniture. It's got a nice flat top, and there are wireless charging pads up here, which we'll talk about. So you could almost build this into a little end table in a van or an off-road vehicle or something like that. And if you were fancy or relatively skilled, you could have a little latched front cover and be able to take this out and move it around your campsite if needed, but have a place to store it and kind of have it be a built-in piece of furniture. Versus the Jackery, where this handle makes it nicer to carry, but it's not as efficient to store, it's not as efficient to transport because it isn't that kind of cube-shaped box. It's got this handle up and protruding, which makes it a little more difficult to move around. So let's take a little tour around the sides of these two devices. We'll start in the least interesting side. This is kind of the first side, nothing on there really. You'll notice the Bluetti has a little fan port here. It does have some vent holes in there for a fan that presumably cools down the inverter and some of the other technology inside. I think that's kind of interesting because you can physically see into the vents and see that fan in there. And they do have these dust covers on all the ports in front, but you could obviously get some dust in there by the fan. I don't know if it doesn't appear that there's any filter or anything in there when you look in there visually. And frankly, I don't think you'd want to have either one of these units in a particularly dusty environment, but kind of funny that they'd be so sensitive to dust with the dust covers, but then not put any kind of filter material on the fan side. Jackery similarly has a fan cover. It's a little less obvious that it's there. They kind of have this different design philosophy. I think the Jackery has a little bit more of an industrial look. It's got these orange panels that contrast with the gray plastic. Got these exposed screws that look kind of cool. I think from an overall design perspective, I'd lean a little bit towards the Jackery. The one thing I don't like on the design is there's a clear split in the plastic that goes all around that looks a little bit meh. The Bluetti did a nice job of hiding all the seams in the plastic, and it's basically kind of a seamless construction and has this shinier gray material and a little bit more of this matte dark gray. Moving on to the backs of the units, again, nothing too exciting here, just a big kind of empty backspace. Bluetti does have some specifications on here. The Jackery has its FCC stickers and all that stuff down in the bottom. Now moving on to this side, things start to get a little more interesting. On the Jackery, we have a light here. I think it's nice that they threw a light in there. Where it's particularly useful is if you're getting this unit and the power's out, there's no light around, or maybe you're walking down a path at a campsite, you can turn it on, and while you're carrying it like that gigantic lunchbox, you can have a little bit of a path light to guide you. What someone mentioned in the comments is that you can also hold this button down and it'll do a SOS type beacon. What's interesting and perhaps a bit amusing, my Morse code's a little rusty, but as far as I know, SOS is dash 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 dot 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 dash dash dash. This seems to send dash 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 dot dot dash dash dash. Which again, my Morse code's a little rusty, but I think that's SYS instead of SOS. So if you were in an emergency scenario, you had this on your window and we're sending out SYS to the world, don't be surprised if someone writes back and says bro in Morse code. So moderately useful, no equivalent on the Bluetti, but there are little USB flashlights, I guess you could call them, that are on kind of a metallic bendable stalk that you could just plug in there. So if you wanted a little bit of a light so you could see your ports, see the devices that you were charging, that would be pretty easy to add on. The Bluetti does have a bit of a difference from the Jackery in that the power inputs are on the side down here, and there's two of them. There's one that they call an aviation jack, which you can use with a variety of adapters to get everything from car power to additional solar power. And there's also a AC input, which is the smaller jack in here. This aviation connector does appear to be a somewhat standard connector. You can order from Amazon kind of connector kits with male and female adapters that you can build your own connectors should you need to. Jackery again has its inputs up on the front. There are these two proprietary plugs that, despite doing some initial research, I can't find out if they're a standard plug or if there's a particular part number you can look to order some of these. So you're kind of left dealing with Jackery for whatever adapters you want on the input side. In terms of the power inputs, the cable that Bluetti gives you does have standard MC4 connectors on the end that plug into this aviation jack. You can use those with most solar panels. I believe that's the standard, is that MC4 connection on a variety of solar panels. I have Jackery panels that have Jackery's older connector that looks like this, will fit into this plug, but doesn't work without an adapter. They do have something that goes from this mysterious Jackery plug to an MC4. And the DC connection front is a little bit of the Wild West. Unfortunately, it's not as easy as plugging into a wall outlet or plugging into a USB jack. And particularly once you start to get into solar, you're probably going to need some adapters if you're going from one company's panels to another company's battery bank. Moving on to the front is where things start to get vastly different. And just looking, you can see that the Bluetti obviously has a significantly more ports, more output options, and a larger screen, which we'll talk about quite a bit. Just going by kind of physical first glance, the Jackery is organized with this circle concept where they group together different types of inputs and outputs with these orange circles, which is kind of nice. Each one has a button that will turn that element of the device on or off. So if you want to see the display, you hit the button over here. If you want to power up the DC outputs, you hit that button over there. Similar thing for AC, you got a button over there. And then there's another button for the DC 12-volt cigarette/car adapter style plug. I like being able to turn things on and off on an individual basis. What's sometimes challenging is if you plug something into the DC, if you plug in a USB phone charger and then you plug in something into the 12-volt side and forget to activate that, unless you are a bit observant, you won't necessarily notice right off the bat that you didn't plug it or you didn't activate that second element of the DC. The Bluetti, in contrast, has one button for DC on that turns on the entire DC side of the device, has another button for AC on, which turns on the entire AC and inverter-driven side of the device. So, kind of obvious, nice layout and interface on the Jackery. A little bit easier to comprehend. If you were saying to somebody that wasn't necessarily sure what was going on with these devices, hey, hit the button here, whatever you plugged in, that would probably make sense, assuming they didn't forget that there's a button next to each section of outputs. Bluetti, a little less well organized. Everything's kind of grouped together, but you have to start to go into the menu system to turn on the different outputs. In terms of physical output counts, Jackery's got 3 AC outputs on the 1500. On the 2000, again, kind of remember that idea of the 2000 is 25% more of everything. You have 25% more AC outlets, so you have a grand total of 4. On the Bluetti, you have 6. In terms of USB, you have 1 USB-C, 2 standard USB. On the Jackery, you have a whopping 4 standard USB on the Bluetti and 1 USB-C. Both of them are USB-C power delivery, so you can charge a MacBook, you can charge some of the higher draw USB-C devices. Both of these have a 12-volt cigarette style output that's behind a rubberized cover. And the Bluetti also gives you one of these RV/aviation plug outputs. So theoretically, it's a higher amp plug. You could have one plug that goes from this device into an RV, into a camping trailer, or something like that. You could wire up a custom input to a room in your house or something like that and have some power redundancy and have that ability to power a significant number of DC devices. And this is your 12-volt cigarette output. Bluetti also has this 12-volt 3-amp output. It's got these 2 little metal connectors. They make several adapters, so you can have a 12-volt cigarette lighter, kind of external plug that plugs in here. You could presumably wire up your own connectors. Again, I'm not sure. I believe this is a standard. I was able to find the plug specifications for this, and you can order on Amazon and build your own adapters should you want to do that. In terms of the one interesting difference between the Jackery 1500 and the Jackery 2000 is the 2000 seems to have its AC adapter built in. So on the back of the 2000, it looks essentially quite similar to this unit, except there is an AC input, and it's a female version of the standard AC power cord that you plug into the back of a computer, a monitor, power brick, that kind of standardized trapezoidal looking plug. And what I understand is that they built the charger, the AC charger, into the unit. So you've got one less thing to carry around. And why that's important and interesting is because the power bricks for these 2 units are literally bricks. So here's the Bluetti brick, and here is the Jackery 1500 brick. If the 2000 does indeed meet that ability that they've advertised, where the charging circuitry is internal to the unit, you don't have to worry about carrying this thing around, which is quite a big benefit from my perspective. The Jackery brick that comes with 1500 I think is a little nicer. It's a little smaller, a little more solid, nicer plastic. It's this Hunt Key company that I've never heard of, but it's the same company that made the adapter for their 5000. It just feels nicer, feels a little more solid. Plastic's a little stronger, has a little light that lets you know it's plugged in, and doesn't have any fans, so it doesn't make any noise unless you put it right up to your ear. You can hear some capacitor whine while it's charging. The Bluetti power brick, on the other hand, this guy's a brick, it says Bluetti on it, has that same textured plastic, but plastic's not as nice and thick. I don't know if you can hear this. You can push on it, you can make a little noise. Just the quality of the labeling and everything on it isn't as nice. There's 2 fans on either side. I believe this does supply 500 watts, so it charges this gigantic machine fairly fast, which is the benefit. But as soon as you plug in, the fans are going to start to spin, whether you're charging or not, whether it's plugged into the actual Bluetti or not. And if you're going to be going on a long trip where you might want to charge off AC, you're going to need to bring this big old honkin' 2-pound, noisy device, which if I were staying in a hotel room between campsites or something like that, I would probably not necessarily want to have this in the background running while I was trying to sleep. So let's talk about the displays for both of these. The Jackery's the simpler of the two. You hit the display button, it turns on. I've complained in the past in terms of YouTube reviews, the display will auto shut off after a few seconds. You'll see it flick off eventually as I'm here talking to you, which is annoying for a video review where I'd rather have it stay on. It's nice if you're camping. This thing has minimal lights. You can see everything is turned on right now, including the display. You have these relatively dim green lights, which is kind of nice. They're not going to make a lot of light pollution when you're camping. The other great thing about this display, there's not a ton of information on it, but what's there is quite useful. You've got your battery capacity remaining, you've got your power draw, your power input, but you also have your runtime remaining. So once you start plugging in devices, after 3 or 4 seconds, it'll figure out the consumption and estimate how much time you have left in the battery, which is a hugely beneficial feature. You can do a whole bunch of math and figure that out. The formulas aren't complex. It's basically some multiplication and division, but this saves you the math. You can look at a glance and say, hey, I've got a lot of things plugged into this right now. I'm on a 3-day camping trip and the display is saying I'm going to run out in 2 hours. Maybe I need to back off on the number of things I have plugged into the device. The Bluetti, on the other hand, I would kind of equate it more as a difference between the Jackery being a piece of camping gear that's got a display that tells you some interesting stuff. The Bluetti's kind of a power generation station, for lack of a better description. When you hit the power button, it has to essentially boot up. The Jackery is kind of always on. Where this adds a bit of nuance is the Bluetti won't charge unless you turn it on. So you can plug in the AC adapter, it'll be humming away and running its fans, and this guy isn't actually accepting any power unless you've turned him on, which you do with this nice big power button. Fairly easy to see, has this nice obvious green ring around it, which indicates that it's on. You'll see the screen comes up and it literally has to boot up before you can start to interact with the screen. Again, kind of being that distinction of this is a piece of power equipment and this is more a piece of camping equipment or kind of a piece of consumer electronics equipment. In terms of design on the Bluetti, tons of information on the screen. It's a touch screen, there's all sorts of menus. It's got kind of that typical, less design forward, I would say, aspect to it, in that there's one font for all the static information, there's a different font that doesn't really match with the other font for any dynamic information, like the battery charge percentage. That may not annoy some people at all. It may annoy people with more of a design focus quite a bit. I'm somewhere in the middle. In terms of basic operation, once you turn it on, you see the percentage of power that's in the unit. You've got 2 little touchscreen buttons down here that'll turn on the DC side and the AC side. We'll hit those guys right now. You get a little confirmation prompt and you'll hear some relays clicking. I'll do the AC and I'll be quiet so you can hear the beeps and the relays. I guess they do that confirmation piece in case you accidentally brushed up against it, but it does give you 2 button pushes to get any of the outputs on. But once they're on, they're on. Once you've turned on AC, all 6 of these outlets are active. Once you've turned on DC, everything on this side of the unit is active, as well as the wireless charging pads up top. And the wireless charging pads, let me see if I can tilt this without killing myself. As far as I know, these are standard QI wireless charging pads. They work fine for an iPhone. I've put AirPods on them. I put everything I have that wirelessly charges. Works great. It'll say there's a 12-watt draw on the screen when I have a device charging wirelessly. I think wireless charging is fantastic. I think it's the future. Absolutely love it. I think this is great when you're out camping and you can walk by, throw your device on there, have it pick up some juice, walk by and grab it without plugging things in and out all the time. And it gives you essentially 2 free USB ports. If you're out with the Jackery and you need to charge a couple phones at night, you've used up 2 out of your 2 USB ports. This guy, you throw a couple phones up top there, you still have these 4 USB ports available to charge flashlights, to charge other devices. So this really gives you a ton of capacity in charging small devices. The other thing with the screen, you can get every piece of information you want. You can get very detailed levels of information about power draw. You can see how many amps each output is pulling, how many watts, essentially any statistic you'd ever want, but you don't get battery time remaining, which makes no sense to me whatsoever. I mean, yes, you can do the calculation based on all the data you have. You can do the calculation on each individual output if you wanted to, but it doesn't do it for you, which is absolutely flabbergasting to me based on the amount of information they give you in here. I'm not sure if there's a way you can upgrade the firmware. I'm not sure if any of these USB ports are a data port and if they could fix that in some future iteration, but it just seems like a huge miss. Now, from a YouTube video perspective, you can see the screen stays on without a user intervention. It'll stay on as long as you like. From a being out in the wilderness perspective, you've got this giant green light, you've got this display that's always on, and I'll turn off the lights for a second so you can see what these look like in a somewhat dark room. So it's a little spooky now that the lights are off, but you can see Jackery's relatively, he didn't turn off on me. You just have these 3 little green LEDs. That's all that's on when it's operating. It's silent right now because we're not doing any AC draw. If you are using the AC, the inverter will pick up eventually. The Bluetti, you've got this big green orb, and you've got the screen that are on. Now you could put some electrical tape over either of these. You could build a little flap, throw a tarp over it, which is generally what I do when I'm camping anyway, because you don't want these to get rained on. But a lot more light there, which could be a feature or it could be a bug depending on the scenario you're going to find yourself using this in. Final element to talk about is the companies behind these. Each of these companies is based in China. Jackery seems to have some sort of US presence. That's important for some people, less important for others. I would say Jackery seems to be a little bit more sophisticated on the marketing front. Their website's a little bit more well designed. There's a little bit more information, a little bit easier to find things. Bluetti, again, website not as nice. It seems like their product design and quality and just kind of overall maturity as a company is a little bit behind Jackery, which makes sense based on when these companies were founded. And clearly a bit of a different philosophy behind the design of these two. I think Jackery very much wanted to make this something you would use for camping, kind of a tool that would power your devices that you wouldn't have to think too much about. Bluetti wanted to build a power system where you can customize it, a lot more input potential, a lot more different outputs, a lot more data and information you can get on the screen. I believe this can take a significant amount more solar input. The Jackery can still take 4 of their 100-watt panels. So kind of a question of philosophically, where are you? Do you want something that you throw in the back of your vehicle and take camping and don't really worry about? Do you want something that is a bit of a more heavy unit but gives you a lot more functionality that maybe you build into a camping van type setup? Or maybe it's something you have in a house or a cabin and it's kind of a power backup situation that sits there and you're not necessarily transporting or moving around a lot. For me, there's not one obvious benefit of one versus the other. I would think through that philosophical question of, do you want the easy to use? Do you want the expandable, more inputs and outputs? Price is obviously a consideration. Jackery seems to have promotions running on a fairly regular basis, so if you see either of these units for full price, I would wait a little bit and wait for a promotion to come out. The Bluetti does seem to be a little more aggressively priced, and that could be due to trying to get a little more market traction. Could be due to some of the places where they've cut quality a little bit, like on the power brick. But otherwise, as far as my usage, it's been flawless essentially. So that's it for this big battle of the 2 power titans. If you like this video, leave me some thoughts in the comments. I may try and do some other comparative reviews between some of the different manufacturers that are out here. I also have another video in the works on why you might want one of these versus a gas powered generator or vice versa. So that's probably the first thing I would consider if you were looking at power backup for general emergency preparedness or Austin type scenario where you have utility power out for quite a while, or camping or something like that. I don't think you can beat a unit like this. There's that whole aspect of not having any noise, not having to worry about bringing fuel with you, and it's just a little bit more of an outdoor friendly type device. So that's it for me. Hope you now are empowered and ready to have a charged up day. Mash that like button if you feel up to it, and look forward to more power reviews, truck related information, and just general shenanigans. Hope you're all well, and keep rocking.